January 23, 2026. In the Donetsk and Lyman sectors of eastern Ukraine, the battlefield did not erupt with artillery fire or armored advances. It simply watched. From above, the air remained crowded with unseen observers. Below, movement slowed, then stopped. Soldiers moved carefully, paused longer than planned, and hesitated in places that once felt safe. Forests stood still. Ruins offered silence, not protection. What unfolded that day was not a dramatic clash, and not a single decisive strike. It was something quieter and more disturbing. A shift in how war behaves when the sky never looks away. When airspace becomes saturated with low-cost drones, long-held assumptions about cover, movement, and survival begin to collapse. This is a story about that collapse. Across the Donetsk and Lyman sectors, Ukrainian UAV and FPV units did not appear in short bursts or during major offensives. They remained in the air almost continuously, creating a form of pressure that never fully lifted and slowly erased the idea that any moment on the ground could be considered safe. From early morning through late evening, reconnaissance drones cycled through overlapping patrols, handing targets from one operator to another, so observation did not depend on a single flight or a single battery. Even when no strike followed, the presence itself shaped behavior, because soldiers could no longer assume that danger came and went in waves. It simply stayed. This constant aerial watch removed the value of terrain features that had protected infantry for decades. Forests around Donetsk, once trusted as natural cover, became transparent when viewed from above, especially as drones adjusted altitude and angle to look through gaps in the canopy. Tree lines that once broke line of sight from ground units lost their meaning when the observer was no longer at eye level. Uneven ground, shallow dips, and small rises offered no lasting protection because drones could circle, hover, and wait for movement to reveal itself. What mattered was not how dense the forest looked from below, but how clearly shapes and paths stood out when seen from the sky. As surveillance became persistent rather than periodic, time itself began to change on the battlefield. In earlier conflicts, soldiers learned to move during perceived quiet windows, short gaps between patrols or after artillery fire faded, moments when observation was likely reduced. In Donetsk and Lyman, those windows largely disappeared. Soldiers had to assume that every pause, every step, and every adjustment of position could be seen, even if nothing happened right away. This created a constant mental strain, because danger was no longer tied to sound or contact, but to the simple act of existing in open space. The absence of immediate strikes did not bring relief. It increased uncertainty. When drones observed without attacking, it forced Russian units to guess whether they were being tracked for later action, mapped for future movement, or simply monitored as part of a wider picture. That uncertainty slowed decisions, stretched reaction time, and made even routine tasks feel risky. A short walk between positions took longer. A pause behind cover became hesitant. Over hours and days, this pressure accumulated, not through violence, but through the knowledge that observation never truly stopped. This shift marks a clear break from traditional military thinking. For most of the modern era, doctrine assumed that observation had limits, whether caused by terrain, weather, darkness, or the physical range of sensors. Commanders planned around these gaps, using them to rotate units, move supplies, or reposition forces with reduced risk. In Donetsk and Lyman, those assumptions no longer held. Low-cost drones, networked operators, and real-time video erased many of the blind spots that older systems relied on. Observation became cheap, flexible, and nearly constant, changing the balance between those watching and those being watched. What makes this transformation especially important is that it does not require overwhelming firepower. Ukrainian drone units did not need to strike every detected position to control the battlefield. The control came from presence, from the steady reminder that concealment was uncertain and temporary at best. In this environment, safety was no longer defined by location, but by timing, and even timing offered no guarantee. Soldiers could not wait out the threat because the threat did not leave. With concealment no longer reliable, the danger shifts from where soldiers hide to how and when they move. In the Donetsk and Lyman sectors, Russian soldiers who moved alone or in small groups were often discovered early. But what followed was not an immediate attack. It was silence, and that silence was deliberate. Ukrainian UAV and FPV operators regularly detected individual figures or small formations as soon as they left cover, yet many of these targets were allowed to continue moving for long periods. From the ground, nothing seemed to happen, but from above, every step was being recorded, measured, and placed into a wider pattern. This early detection without instant violence created a dangerous illusion that the movement had gone unnoticed. The reason for this restraint was tactical, not technical. Ukrainian drone teams used prolonged tracking to understand how soldiers behaved, once they believed they were unobserved. Operators watched which paths were chosen, how often individuals stopped, and where they tended to slow down or change direction. Over time, this revealed intended routes, likely destinations, and the places where soldiers expected safety. Instead of reacting to movement, the drones learned it, turning the landscape into a map of habits rather than just positions. This approach made the eventual strike far more effective. By waiting, FPV operators could choose moments when targets were most exposed, such as crossing open ground, approaching structures, or committing to a narrow path with limited escape options. Delayed engagement also reduced the chance of missed attacks, because the drone did not rush toward a target that might suddenly disappear under cover. When the strike finally came, it came at a point where the outcome was almost certain, not dramatic, but decisive. The psychological impact of this method was just as important as the physical damage. Soldiers who were not attacked right away began to question their own awareness, wondering whether they had truly been seen or whether the threat was imagined. This uncertainty turned movement into a mental burden. Every step carried doubt, and every pause invited fear that the mistake had already been made minutes earlier. Over time, this pressure slowed movement, broke confidence, and made simple tasks feel dangerous. Delayed engagement also shifted the balance of control. Instead of reacting to the enemy, Ukrainian operators dictated the timing, location, and conditions of contact. Russian soldiers no longer chose when they were in danger. The danger chose them. This removed the sense of initiative at the individual level, leaving soldiers to operate under constant stress without clear feedback about what actions were safe or unsafe. This method closely mirrors sensor-to-shooter concepts familiar to American military doctrine, but it compresses the process to a scale rarely seen before. In traditional systems, detection, tracking, and engagement often involve multiple units, layers of command, and extended timelines. In the drone environment around Donetsk and Lyman, that entire chain exists within a single operator's field of view. The sensor is the camera, the decision is made in seconds, and the shooter is the same platform that observed the target. What once took coordination across units now happens at the level of one person and one machine. By collapsing this cycle, drones turn observation into control. Detection does not need to lead to immediate action, because the option to strike remains open as long as the target keeps moving. This creates a battlefield where survival depends less on speed or strength, and more on avoiding patterns that can be learned. For soldiers on the ground, that is an almost impossible demand. As movement itself becomes a liability, even structures once designed for protection begin to lose their meaning. For much of modern warfare, abandoned houses, collapsed walls, and ruined buildings were considered some of the safest places on the battlefield because thick masonry could stop shrapnel, block small arms fire, and break the line of sight of enemy forces. In towns around Donetsk and Lyman, these structures once offered soldiers a sense of stability, a place to pause, rest, or wait out danger while artillery passed overhead. From the ground, solid walls still looked reassuring, and the instinct to move into hard cover remained strong, even as the nature of the threat had already changed. That instinct has become increasingly dangerous. FPV drones do not approach like traditional attackers, moving at ground level or firing from a distance. They enter space. Operators guide them through doors left open by blast waves, windows shattered by earlier fighting, and gaps torn into walls by shelling. Just as important, drones exploit vertical angles that infantry rarely think about in the moment. A building that feels protected on 3 sides offers no defense from above, where roofs are thin, damaged, or missing entirely. What once slowed an attack now helps trap it in place. Aerial access changes the value of hard cover completely. Walls are designed to stop bullets and fragments moving horizontally, not to defeat threats that can descend, hover, and adjust position in midair. Even thick concrete loses meaning when a drone can approach from the roofline, pause, and choose the best point of entry. In many recorded strikes, the drone does not rush inside, it waits, confirming movement and positioning before committing. The protection of mass and material disappears once the attacker controls angle and timing. This shift also alters how soldiers experience urban space. Rooms that once felt sealed now feel exposed. Corners that once offered safety become dead ends. Every opening becomes a possible entry point, not just for observation but for attack. As a result, structures that once reduced risk now concentrate it. When an FPV strikes inside a confined space, the blast is amplified, turning the shelter into part of the weapon itself. The building does not fail, it assists the strike. The implications for future urban warfare are significant. Traditional urban defense relies on controlling streets, intersections, and lines of approach at ground level. FPV drones break this logic by ignoring those paths entirely. They do not need to clear buildings or advance block by block. Instead, they move through the air, choosing entry points that defenders cannot easily block without sealing themselves in completely. Vertical dominance begins to outweigh horizontal control, and the idea of a defensible position shifts from location to constant movement. This change challenges long-standing training models. Infantry are taught to seek hard cover, to move into structures, and to use walls to shape the fight. In a drone-saturated environment, those habits can become liabilities. Protection no longer comes from what surrounds a soldier, but from how quickly a position can be abandoned once it is observed. Urban terrain, once complex and protective, becomes simplified from the sky, where outlines, openings, and movement are easy to read. As more conflicts move into cities, this pattern is likely to repeat. The tools may change, but the advantage of aerial access will remain. Buildings will continue to offer comfort to those on the ground, even as they offer opportunity to those above. Without effective countermeasures, the logic of urban shelter continues to erode, one structure at a time. When walls no longer protect, soldiers instinctively turn to improvisation, often with little effect. As FPV attacks became more frequent around Donetsk and Lyman, Russian soldiers turned to the most immediate responses available, firing rifles at incoming drones or freezing beneath foliage in the hope of avoiding detection. These reactions were instinctive rather than planned, shaped by training that prepared troops to face visible enemies on the ground, not small machines approaching from above. In many cases, soldiers raised their weapons only after a drone was already close, leaving little time to aim, track, or adjust before impact. What felt like action on the ground often had no real effect in the air. Small arms fire rarely solved the problem. FPV drones approach at irregular angles and speeds, often changing direction in the final seconds, which makes accurate fire extremely difficult even for experienced shooters. The drones are also small targets, and their operators can keep them moving just enough to avoid a clean shot. Firing upward adds another disadvantage, as recoil, limited elevation, and stress reduce accuracy. Even when shots are fired, the time needed to confirm a hit usually comes too late to prevent the strike. Remaining motionless under trees or bushes has also proven ineffective. From below, foliage feels thick and protective, but from above, movement patterns and body shapes still stand out. Drones do not rely on a single glance, they observe over time. A soldier who stops moving does not disappear, he simply becomes a fixed point that can be studied longer. Subtle changes, such as shifting weight or adjusting equipment, often reveal presence more clearly than motion across open ground. What seems like concealment at eye level becomes exposure from the sky. The persistence of drones further undermines these countermeasures. Unlike manned aircraft, FPVs can hover, circle, and wait for mistakes without concern for fuel or pilot fatigue. Operators can afford patience, watching for minutes until a clear opportunity appears. This removes the benefit of quick reactions because the threat does not pass. The drone remains, adjusting position, maintaining pressure, and forcing the soldier to choose between movement and stillness, neither of which guarantees safety. Behind these failed responses lies a deeper issue. At the tactical edge, Russian units lack effective low-level counter-drone systems that can operate with infantry in real time. Electronic jamming, short-range air defense, and dedicated detection tools are either absent, limited in number, or not integrated at the squad and platoon level. Without these tools, soldiers are left to rely on personal weapons and improvisation, neither of which is suited to defeating agile aerial threats. This gap reflects decisions made long before contact. Doctrine, training programs, and procurement priorities were built around threats that fit older models of warfare, where air defense was centralized and drones were scarce. As FPVs became common, adaptation lagged behind. Training did not shift fast enough, equipment distribution remained uneven, and frontline units were left to learn through experience. The result was not a failure of courage or effort, but a mismatch between preparation and reality. Framing this as an individual failure misses the larger point. Soldiers responded with the tools and habits they had, not with the systems they needed. When entire units repeat the same ineffective actions, it signals a structural problem rather than poor judgment. Modern battlefields punish delays in adaptation, and in Donetsk and Lyman, that punishment arrived through the air, one encounter at a time. These weaknesses become even more dangerous once soldiers and equipment are forced to move along predictable paths. Russian forces around Donetsk and Lyman continue to rely on familiar logistics routes, not because they are safe, but because they are known. And in a pressured environment, habit often replaces adaptation. Supply roads, approach paths, and staging areas were built over months of use, shaped by terrain and distance rather than by the new reality of constant aerial watch. Changing these routes requires time, coordination, and protection, all of which are difficult when drones can observe every adjustment. As a result, units return to the same corridors even after they have been exposed, hoping speed or timing will compensate for visibility. This predictability becomes deadly once airspace is persistently monitored. Ukrainian UAVs do not need to search widely when movement follows routine patterns. Repeated use of the same roads allows operators to learn schedules, identify choke points, and wait for convoys to appear. When observation never pauses, even a short delay or a minor traffic buildup increases risk. Vehicles that move in sequence create clear signatures from above, turning logistics into a visible chain rather than a hidden flow. Ukrainian drone units exploit this advantage through constant pressure rather than isolated strikes. Formations such as the Signum Battalion maintain regular FPV activity over key routes and positions, forcing Russian units to choose between exposure and withdrawal. Instead of attacking every convoy immediately, drones create an environment where resupply becomes uncertain and holding ground grows costly. Over time, positions that were maintained for months become difficult to support, leading to gradual pullbacks rather than sudden collapse. In response, Russian forces have experimented with motorcycles and other light vehicles to move faster and reduce detection. These platforms are meant to break up convoys and limit visible mass, but they introduce new problems. Without armor or protection, riders are fully exposed, and their movement is easy to track once spotted. FPV drones can match their speed, follow their path, and strike with precision. What was intended as a way to slip through observation instead becomes an invitation for pursuit. The shift from heavy convoys to light mobility highlights the dilemma of modern logistics under drone control. Reducing visibility often increases vulnerability, while adding protection slows movement and concentrates targets. In this balance, drones favor the observer, not the mover. Every solution creates a new pattern, and every pattern can be learned. Even nature itself, once relied upon for concealment, now works against those on the ground. Winter in the Donetsk and Lyman sectors does not hide movement. It reveals it. And snow-covered terrain turns the battlefield into a clear record of every decision made on the ground. What once seemed like nature's camouflage now works in the opposite direction, because white surfaces sharpen contrast and strip away the visual noise that soldiers once relied on for concealment. From above, the landscape becomes simpler, cleaner, and easier to read. And that clarity favors the observer, not the one being observed. Footprints are the first betrayal. In fresh snow, a single set of tracks can mark not only where a soldier is, but where he has been and where he is likely going. These lines do not fade quickly, especially in cold conditions, and UAV operators can follow them backward to previous positions or forward to intended shelter. Tire tracks add even more information, revealing vehicle size, direction, speed, and stopping points. What appears temporary on the ground becomes a lasting signature from the air, one that can be studied without urgency. Heat also works against concealment. Engines, exhaust systems, and even recently occupied positions leave warmth that contrasts sharply with cold surroundings. Snow melts unevenly around vehicles, turning roads and stopping areas into visible patterns. Disturbed ground exposes darker soil beneath the white surface, creating shapes that stand out clearly from altitude. Even without advanced sensors, standard drone cameras can pick up these changes, especially when operators compare real-time images with earlier passes. Bare trees further remove protection. In warmer months, foliage breaks outlines and hides movement, but winter strips branches clean, opening sightlines that did not exist before. Forests lose depth and density, becoming thin screens rather than solid cover. From above, individual figures and small groups stand out against uniform backgrounds, and any movement draws immediate attention. Soldiers who once trusted tree lines as safe routes now find themselves crossing exposed corridors, visible from multiple angles. This environment also reduces the effectiveness of camouflage. White coverings may match snow at a glance, but movement quickly defeats the illusion. Shifting positions, adjusting equipment, or even turning in place creates contrast that trained operators notice immediately. Camouflage works best when observation is brief and distant, but winter drones observe closely and repeatedly. Over time, even well-concealed positions become familiar shapes in a known pattern. Rather than slowing aerial warfare, winter accelerates it. Cold air improves battery performance in some cases, and stable weather conditions can extend flight windows. Snow reflects light, improving visibility for cameras during daylight, while long nights offer opportunities for thermal observation. The season does not pause drone activity. It stretches its reach across hours that were once considered marginal. The psychological effect mirrors the physical one. Soldiers accustomed to seeing winter as protection are forced to rethink every movement. Tracks cannot be erased quickly. Heat cannot be hidden easily. Trees no longer promise safety. This constant exposure creates hesitation and fatigue, as every step leaves evidence that may remain long after the moment has passed. Winter becomes not a shield, but a memory of movement written into the terrain. For UAV operators, snow simplifies the battlefield. Patterns emerge faster. Mistakes are easier to spot. The margin for error shrinks, not because weapons are stronger, but because information is clearer. In this environment, patience becomes even more powerful, as drones can wait for targets to commit to visible paths that cannot be concealed afterward. Taken together, these elements reveal a battlefield where safety is no longer tied to terrain, season, or structure. By early 2026, the pattern across Donetsk and Lyman had become clear and deeply unfavorable for Russian forces, because constant drone surveillance, delayed FPV strikes, exposed supply routes, collapsing shelter logic, and winter visibility were no longer separate problems. They merged into one continuous operational trap. Soldiers were seen before they moved, followed while they advanced, and struck only when escape was no longer possible. while logistics suffered the same fate on roads that drones already knew by memory. Snow, ruined buildings, and forests did not slow this process. They accelerated it, turning every mistake into visible evidence from above. This is not just a Russian failure. It is a warning about modern warfare itself, where old ideas of cover, timing, and protection no longer hold once the air is fully controlled. For American viewers, the question is simple but uncomfortable. How prepared are any modern armies for a battlefield that never blinks? If you want clear, grounded analysis of how wars are actually changing, make sure to subscribe to Military Force, where we break down these shifts before they reach the next conflict.